Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our regularly scheduled panelists for today. First, we have Mr. Andre Wong, who is the General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Dr. Wilmer Leon, who's a nationally syndicated columnist and a regular contributor to national and international television news programs and newspapers. We have Mr. Rashawn Baker, who's the president and CEO of the Baker Strategy Group and a University of Maryland professor of public policy. And we have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. Gentlemen, great having you here with us and looking forward to our show today. You know, one of the issues that we're starting to see a lot of information coming out on is artificial intelligence. And recently we're starting to hear more about artificial intelligence, religious freedom, and economic expansion kind of converging to be part of a conversation that society is looking to engage in. There was a time that there was a symbiotic relationship between artificial intelligence and other things in the computer era, but now we're starting to see that connection between that, religious freedom, and economic growth as becoming something of paramount importance. There have been a number of studies that have been taking place for quite some time that have been trying to underscore the significant positive relationship or co-relationship between artificial intelligence and some of these other areas. But now we're starting to realize that we're starting to see people even determine, how do you engage in marketing? How do you engage in tourism? How do you engage in product sales, in which all of this has to be part of the dialogue? You know, Wilma, when I start to see this happening, and now we look at how tricky artificial intelligence can be, and now to know that they are wrapping in the concept of a religious freedom, and somehow that's becoming the foundation of economic development in many realms of life, you know, what do we see happening here? And it seems as though some of these variables are so nebulous. How could they be used to focus on something as concrete as economic development activities?
Well, I think what we're seeing as it relates to artificial intelligence merging into the realm of religion and economics is we're seeing this manifest itself in the area of surveillance. You have instances where companies are selling artificial intelligence services to congregations, to track congregations, to monitor what's happening inside the religious service or outside the religious service as it relates to facial recognition technologies and other types of areas. It can be sold to the particular church or to the particular service as a safety issue, but at the same time, that data can be collected and can be sold for a number of reasons. So artificial intelligence, like so many other aspects of technology, are being integrated in society at so many levels, at base levels, all the way through some of the most extensive levels of our society, and religion is not exempt from this.
No, that's absolutely right. You know, artificial intelligence has really come into business, actually into our everyday lives, in a way to automate everything, whether it is in the market or in the church. And when it comes to merging both business and religion, you know, religion can be the X factor in business. And one thing you cannot automate is the culture of a common mission in a business climate, and that can be based on religion, or that can be just based on a unified vision of what the business is going to do in the marketplace. Many businesses now have chief belief officers, not necessarily as a chaplain of the company, but someone who just kind of keeps the culture going, and that we're all in this for one unified business mission, and they do employ religious principles in their in their work. So there is a unifying effect of a strong belief system within a company that brings economic prosperity and brings more of a coherent, focused, motivated workforce. That's really a deciding factor in business. So yeah, I think that we are seeing this merge of AI, business, and religion. Perhaps not conspicuously, but we're seeing the principles playing out.
You know, Tim Schultz, you're somebody who advises different religious groups. It seems as though now the data mining that may be taking place in religious organizations that used to be something that was protected or sacrosanct seems to be now so valuable that you can actually change the needle and from an economic development standpoint and other aspects of life. Are you finding those conversations starting to happen more with some of the organizations that you engage in?
Not really. It's because it's not the kinds of organizations that I really work with and the kind of work we do together. I guess I would just say that AI is going to change everything. You know, the ramping up of it it's going to change all of life. I mean, I deal in the legislative sphere, and AI is very likely to be deployed to create misinformation, right? Also to really tailor information and arguments that are made in the public sector to try to find what's most persuasive. There's some early evidence that AI chatbots have been effective at persuading people out of conspiracy theories, that they're better at it than human beings are. That's actually a good use of AI as far as I'm concerned. But it's kind of like every powerful technology, Orlin. I mean, there's going to be good, there's going to be bad, and then if it's really powerful, people are going to worship it.
Well, you know, Sharon, the flip side of this is I recently had a conversation with some leadership at the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, and they wanted to figure out a way to start talking to individuals in the church community because they started to realize that over the last couple of years that church members are being targeted more for financial fraud activities to the point that there was over, I believe, $500 million of fraudulent activity taking place because someone has decided that they were focusing on data, zeroing in on a certain group. And on one hand, it can be used for good, but on the other hand, we clearly see it can be used for bad as well.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, that's the part I think that frightens on the secular side that frightens people the most is the fact that you can use it to target individuals to give up their resources, their money, and things of that nature. Also, what Tim was saying is that I think the other fear is anytime faith groups look at artificial intelligence or anything like that, you start to have a collision with your faith and whether, in fact, this is a road you want to go down through. And I think that concerns a lot of people in the faith community that is this something of man going too far or woman going too far in terms of our scientific knowledge? And I think it's concerning. There are a lot of things that can go wrong, as you mentioned about targeting, but there's also the misinformation or the ability to use AI to form another break off religious group that people would, as Tim said, may start worshiping. And so I think that frightens group, and we have to be mindful of it, both at the faith side and the secular side.
But Andre, wouldn't you be really, out of your mind not to be taking into consideration the faith community? You've got hundreds of thousands of people and millions of people that are literally thinking about faith on a regular basis. To really not bring that into the lexicon of how you decide what you want to do every day, I think you're missing out on a major part of society. It almost seems like this has to take place.
Yeah. So, AI, the thing that it cannot replace is the sentient human element. And there was a pastor a few weeks ago that went 2 minutes into his sermon and then paused, and he said, the message I just delivered to you for the last 2 minutes was generated by AI. I put no critical thought into it whatsoever. And so, the congregation sitting there is thinking, well, if you're going to feed us this, and what else will be coming down the pike? And so, we're also seeing this in our universities where I was part of a group of instructors that discussed the use of AI in the classroom. Some professors said, well, we should let our students use it because that's the wave of the future. And the other half said, no, well, we shouldn't let them use AI because we're removing critical thinking out of the classroom.
We went through this as a world. We went through this with the invention of the printing press. We went through this with during the Industrial Revolution. Congregations had to adjust their services, their times of services, because as we moved from an agrarian culture and economy into an industrialized economy, this is the next wave of technology impacting culture. And what we're seeing, it's manifesting itself at the very base level of culture, which is religion.
So, Tim, from a legislative standpoint, where you see a lot of this activity happening, how do you think you have to end up advising as to, even some of the language that we're seeing that are being utilized are being created in a way that people say, well, it makes sense from a legislative standpoint? I'll tell you something that was interesting. We were having a meeting where I'm part of religion where we have 28 fundamental beliefs, and somebody went into AI and said, based on what you see here, create number 29. A few seconds later, shot up on the screen. And most of us looked at it and said, I could probably work with that. Where does this go and where does it not go from your perspective?
I honestly, I just can't say. I think that we'll look back at this, at this inflection point in technology and say that it was at least as impactful as, the rise of the internet, at least as impactful as the saturation, social media, at least as impactful as the ubiquity of smartphones in everybody's hands. Which is to say, there's got to be a mix of good and bad. And I'm a Christian, and I also believe that the devil is always at work in these situations too. And so I think we'll see new ways that depravity can flourish that we have not even yet imagined. So I think that's a pretty safe prediction, Erlen.
Real quick, if I could.
Sure, please.
This I draw a parallel between this and additives in food. And what I mean by that is disclaimers. We need, to your point about the 29th tenant, that needed to be identified as artificially created, a full disclosure disclaimer so people can understand from whence it's come.
Now, I was going to say that's exactly where I think you're going to start seeing is the legislative purpose will be disclaimers and making sure that people know up front. If you're given a sermon that's generated by AI, you have to let them know. The same thing with any documentation that's going out, that it has to have that disclaimer on it. And I think that's the only way, because you're not going to stop AI from being used. A law school friend of mine actually generated a document by AI, and it was actually very good. So
they've done it in court.
Yeah, so he's like,
found that the whole thing
you got to tell your clients.
They presented it in court and found out that the whole document was wrong. The cases cited were wrong.
Well, and I think that's going to be where we are with this, this issue of a change in technology. At the end of the day, disclosure will probably end up making the difference in the end. There was a case that's called the Diocese of Albany versus Harris. And this is an interesting case because back in 2017, the New York State Department of Financial Services mandated that employers cover abortions if their employee health insurance plans. But following that order, there was a diverse coalition of religious groups that included all kinds of different religions. And they came in and said that we do not believe that we should be forced to engage in this activity because it violates our religious beliefs. But the New York State courts pushed back in the other direction. And now we find ourselves in court now fighting through the question, can you mandate through your employment certain quote unquote coverages from a health perspective that must take place? When you think about this case, Rashawn, that's in New York, that's battling back and forth, they're battling over the ideas, well, depending on what your religious beliefs may be. We're talking about Catholic nuns, we're talking about Anglican nuns, we're talking about other faith-based ministries. The idea of what you believe having something to do with your health plans and your health coverages Should they be separate? Should they come into play? Or really is this something that becomes a no issue or a non-issue at all?
Well, it certainly is an issue. And I think it comes into play around certain aspects of healthcare. Certainly things like abortion is going to be one of those. And that's where this case came into. It wasn't just providing access to healthcare, it was providing a particular procedure. And I think you're going to see more and more of these cases coming to light as the secular world and the faith world collide in a way that we haven't seen before. And they're going to move up to the Supreme Court. In this case, it clearly, this probably is the brightest line of some of the cases we're going to see in the future, because it talked about offering abortion care to their employees. That clearly is a line that many faiths are not, whether you're Catholic, whether you're Muslim or others, are not going to want to do. And so I think that's the question that we're dealing with. On the secular side, having been in government, you want everyone to have access to all healthcare. On the faith side, should we tell a faith community they have to provide this particular type of care?
Tim Schultz, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that that's right. And I just think this is a really bad decision by New York, and gratuitously bad. I mean, I think it was foreseeable that this would be an outrage to many faith communities and not just Christian ones. I think in the modern world, faith communities have employees that they want to provide good health benefits to. And I think just telling them, okay, now you have to pay for something that goes against your very deepest principles, I think is, it's absolutely outrageous. And, I don't get outraged easily, but I think this is just gratuitous and outrageous. And I hope that the courts, brush this back, because I think this kind of coercion has no place in a free society.
No, Andre, when I see these type of decisions, you would have thought that we may have actually scrubbed through this concept before and people may have gotten on the same page. But it seems as though as we see the Supreme Court and other what I would call, legal bodies deciding the idea, well, let's push things back in the hands of the state. It seems that what's going to happen is we're going to create even more confusion, because now instead of having one particular law that's going to, cover the day, we'll have 50 different laws happening in 50 different jurisdictions with no question as to which makes the most sense from a United States of America standpoint. Or have I overstated that in some way?
No, that's right, because the U.S. Supreme Court has been down this path, and the judicial history on the Harris case is that while cert was pending before the U.S. Supreme Court on this case, the Supreme Court decided Fulton versus Philadelphia, that ruled unanimously that a Catholic organization was protected to provide its foster care and adoption services and not have to violate its faith principles on marriage. And so when Fulton came down, they granted the petition, vacated the court's judgment, and then remanded it back to the state court for reconsideration in light of Fulton. And so if New York doesn't acknowledge Fulton's impact on free exercise, I think we're going to see this back at the Supreme Court, and they'll take care of it.
But Wilma, this is a confusion. Supreme Court says kick it back to the states. The states engage in an activity, then what does it do? It kicks back up to the Supreme Court again. It seems as though we're in the midst of this kind of circle of activity where everybody wants to pass the hot potato without the idea of saying, you know what, somebody may need to be making this definitive call. I mean, where we are in judiciary right now, it just seems as though we're finding ourselves spinning more than making decisions.
Well, I look at this from a slightly different perspective. When a religious organization or a religious entity decides that it wants to enter into a business operation and has to get a license from the state in order to engage in that business, then it needs to operate as every other business in the state operates. You should not be allowed to discriminate once you have to get a license to operate from the state. And folks can be outraged about their tax dollars going to certain areas, but as our society was formed, I think it was Thomas Hobbes or maybe it was John Locke that came up with the social contract theory, where in order for us to operate peacefully, we have to subvert some of our individual rights for the betterment of the culture. So if the churches want to absolve themselves of their tax, where they don't have to pay taxes, you can't have it both ways. You can't say I'm tax exempt on one hand and then say, but I don't want to function along the lines of the state and licensing practices on the other hand.
What's the
I don't
license that
want-
they had
wait
to
a
have
minute,
to,
wait a
to
minute.
operate?
I don't
What-
want
what
my
license did they
tax
have to have?
dollars to go to pay for genocide in Gaza. Unfortunately, I don't get to make that call. I have to pay my taxes and the government decides because again, social contract theory, you have to subvert some of your personal rights or else everybody runs the stop sign and we wind up having a huge collision in the middle of the intersection.
But what license do they have to operate? Could you explain that to me?
Well, that's why I said if they have to get a license to operate, it depends upon the business that the particular religious group wants to get into. If they don't have to get a license to operate, then what I just said doesn't matter. But there are a number of religious organizations that are entering into business functions where they have to get licenses from the state to operate. And when they do so, then they got to follow the rules of the game.
Well, I think in this case, as Tim was pointing out, and anytime I hear Thomas Hobbes and Locke in a discussion is always a good one.
Well, I am a political scientist, so
is that clearly the state had an interest in providing healthcare, access to healthcare to everyone. And that's where this came into conflict. I think what we're going to start seeing happen here is that, and I can't remember if it was Tim or Orland that said this, but once the Supreme Court decided to kick everything back down to the states, we're going to have these different fights around particular issues, not the overall issue, but the particular case. In this case, it's not necessarily about abortion, but it's about healthcare access at the state level. And so I think you're going to start seeing that until the Supreme Court makes a final decision on faith, what you can do within your faith community as opposed to the secular community, and how much how much leeway does the government have to intersect into faith's belief and in these various faith beliefs. I think that's why you're going to see this conflict.
and I think that's why Thomas Jefferson told us about the separation of church and state. But somehow that very clear distinction and delineation, as it is articulated in the First Amendment, for somehow now has become blurred because religious entities and interests have found their way on the political side, whether it be legislative or whether it be judicial.
Yeah, but in the modern bureaucratic state, it's far bigger than it was by necessity. I'm not criticizing it, but it's far bigger than it was when Thomas Jefferson wrote those things. It is inevitable with the government essentially licensing virtually all of life that government is going to run into conflicts with the church and religious organizations in a way that it did not when Jefferson wrote those words. It's secondly, absolutely. It's well, we're going to have to agree to disagree. The other thing, the Fulton case that Andre talked about, that was a 9-0 decision. Okay. And I think this court is going to find this is also a 9-0 decision if it actually comes before it, because it's basically the same problem that happened in Fulton. And when I say it was 9-0, that means all of the Democratic appointees on the United States Supreme Court agreed that it was a violation of the Free Exercise Clause of the United States Constitution. And I think they were right about that.
And I think they were wrong.
Andre, when you look at this, though, and when you start thinking, it seems as though this concept of the separation of church and state is one thing, but the separation of government and religion may be almost impossible, because it looks like religion is a fabric of what goes on in society, and society basically, includes a number of different microcosms, including those who are religious. It seems as though separation of church and state is an interesting concept, but the separation of government and religion almost seems like you can't separate it out.
Right. If you look at the cases where Fulton was invoked as the base of the decision, you see that you see that interplay of government and religion. So I'm thinking of the military case, the Sikh that was that could not be barred from the Marine Corps for wearing his beard and turbans and other articles of faith. The D.C. Circuit said no, he has a protection to wear those articles of faith. The basis of that decision, Fulton. Same thing with prisoner religious freedom, student association rights, parental rights in public schools. Fulton was the basis of those decisions around the different circuits in the United States. So yeah, I mean we're seeing this play out between religion and government agencies, and I think that this Harris case will be no different.
Well, it also seems that one of the things that we've got to get comfortable with from a societal standpoint is as society changes, we have to be willing to understand that the components of society that we may not have been, quote unquote, comfortable with before are now getting a larger voice, are now making their voices heard. There were times where you might have a point of view that may not be popular and you would decide that you wanted to just keep it quiet on your own. But we now live in a world where no one wants to keep anything quiet, and anything that's important to me should be important to you, and I'm going to make sure that you see it. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
According to Pew Research, there is a 40-point gap between Republicans and Democrats who say society should prioritize marriage and kids. That's an underrated kind of underlying feature of our political divides, and I actually think it's quite worrisome.
Wow. Rashawn Baker, tell me something I don't know.
Since we're talking about the Supreme Court, did you know that William Howard Taft, who's the only president to go on the Supreme Court, never wanted to be president, and Teddy Roosevelt had to convince him to run. So he finally got the job that he always wanted.
Ha ha. Andre Wong, tell me something I don't know.
Speaking of faith in business, although it is the third largest fast food chain, Chick-fil-A makes more money per restaurant than its closest competitor, McDonald's. $4 million per restaurant versus $2 million per restaurant for McDonald's.
Wilmer, tell me something I don't know.
Well, talking about the Supreme Court, on the 12th of June, 1967, the Supreme Court issued the Loving v. Virginia decision, striking down the ban against interracial marriage in Virginia. And in 1963, on September 12th, Medgar Evers was assassinated standing in his driveway in Mississippi.
Wow. Gentlemen, thank you for that information. And it's something that I know that our audience is going to love. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.